concentric circles, but scientists think that there were originally about 80 of them. And the stones themselves, massive. They're 13 feet tall, and some weigh up to 25 tons.
Think about the last time you stared at a blurry photo until your eyes adjusted and you finally saw the hidden image. We've been staring at Stonehenge for 1,000 years, measuring every inch of those massive gray slabs.
An elaborate series of stone monuments believed to have been hidden for thousands of years, not far from the famous site of Stonehenge. And it suggests that mysteries that shroud this region.
We thought we'd read every page of its story, but then we handed the keys to an AI. It didn't see the rocks, but it saw the spaces between them, revealing a secret hiding in plain sight. What AI examined is something no one expected: the digital dusting. For a long time, archaeology was mostly about the physical hustle. It was about heavy boots, sunburns, and the careful flick of a handheld brush against packed dirt. If you wanted to find something new at Stonehenge, you had to dig a hole. The problem with digging holes in a World Heritage Site is that you eventually run out of places to dig. Or worse, you destroy the very context you're trying to save. We reached a point where the human eye had seen every surface and the human hand had mapped every curve. We were essentially stuck in a loop, retelling the same story about midsummer solstices and mysterious druids because we didn't have any new data to chew on. We had reached a ceiling of human observation. Enter the digital revolution. While we were busy looking at the stones, technology was learning how to look through them. Scientists began using things like magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar, GPR, which act like a massive X-ray for the Earth. This generated a staggering amount of information, terabytes of noise that a human brain simply cannot process in a single lifetime. Imagine trying to find a specific grain of sand in a desert by looking through a magnifying glass. You'd give up before you even started. This is exactly why the AI was brought in. It wasn't there to replace the archaeologist, it was there to be the ultimate filter. What makes AI different is its lack of bias. When a human looks at Stonehenge, they bring 500 years of history books and campfire stories with them. We expect to see certain things, so our brains subconsciously filter out the anomalies that don't fit the narrative. The AI doesn't care about the legends. It just sees data points, gradients, and mathematical probabilities. It treats the Salisbury Plain like a massive, complex Sudoku puzzle. By dusting the landscape digitally, the algorithms began to strip away the grass, the topsoil, and the centuries of modern interference to see the skeleton of the land as it existed 4,000 years ago. It started noticing tiny rhythmic pulses in the soil density that shouldn't have been there. Patterns that were too regular to be natural, but too subtle for a human surveyor to flag. This shift from physical digging to digital processing changed the game entirely. We stopped asking, "What is this stone?" and started asking, "What is this space telling us?" The AI began to highlight hotspots on the digital map that looked like nothing more than gray smudges to us, but to the processor, they were clear indicators of human intervention. It was as if the machine was wiping a thick layer of grime off an old window, allowing us to see a backyard we never knew existed. We weren't just looking at a monument anymore, we were looking at a massive, interconnected hard drive made of earth and flint. What happens when the computer starts looking beneath the grass? The hidden geometry. When the AI began processing the subsurface scans of the Salisbury Plain, it didn't just see a map, it saw a complex mathematical language. For centuries, we've focused on the visible circle, those iconic lintels and upright sarsens that define the horizon. We've measured their heights, their weights, and their astronomical alignments until our notebooks were full. But the AI started to look at the negative space. It began to analyze the geometry of what wasn't there, and that is where the unexpected discovery started to take shape. It wasn't a hidden chamber or a buried treasure chest. It was a ghost map of a landscape that had been meticulously engineered on a scale we never dared to imagine. The algorithms were fed high-resolution magnetometry data, which picks up tiny variations in the Earth's magnetic field. This happens when the soil has been disturbed, say, by a hole being dug and then filled back in thousands of years ago. To a human looking at a printout of this data, it looks like digital static, a snowy television screen from the 90s. But to a neural network trained to recognize geometric patterns, that static started to resolve into perfect circles, straight lines, and repeating intervals. The AI flagged a series of anomalies that sat just inches beneath the turf, forming a massive secondary ring of pits and timber posts that completely encircled the known monument. These weren't random, they were spaced with a mathematical precision that suggests the builders had a grasp of geometry far beyond what we credited them with. What was truly shocking was how these ghost structures interacted with the light. We've always known Stonehenge was a solar calendar, but the AI ran simulations of how the sun would have moved across this newly discovered geometry 4,000 years ago. It found that these hidden pits weren't just decorative. They acted like a sophisticated lens. When the sun hit certain markers at specific times of the year, the shadows would have created a pathway of darkness, leading directly to the center of the stones. The AI showed us that Stonehenge wasn't just a destination, it was the heart of a giant interactive light show. The machine was able to calculate the exact angles of these shadows, proving that the entire landscape was tilted and carved to manipulate how a human being would experience the sun's movement. This hidden geometry also revealed a strange rhythmic pulsing in the layout. The AI noticed that the distances between the hidden timber posts followed a specific ratio. When the data scientists looked closer, they realized this ratio was consistent across several other Neolithic sites in the region. This implies a master blueprint was being shared across tribes and generations. The AI basically caught the builders using a standardized unit of measurement, a prehistoric meter, long before we thought such a thing existed. It found that the circle we see today is actually just the inner gear of a much larger machine. There are concentric rings of activity stretching out hundreds of yards, each one serving a specific geometric purpose that ties the Earth to the sky. But the most striking thing the AI flagged was the acoustic geometry. By analyzing the shapes and the density of the stones alongside the newly discovered pits, the software simulated how sound would travel through the site. It found that the arrangement creates a hush effect. If you were standing inside the circle during a ceremony, the geometry of the stones would act as a sound barrier, blocking out the wind of the plains and amplifying voices or drums inside. However, the AI found that the newly discovered outer pits were positioned to catch that sound and bounce it back toward the center. It was a 360-degree surround sound system made of rock and dirt. We always thought they were just building a temple, but the AI proved they were building an amphitheater with acoustics that would rival a modern concert hall. The discovery of this geometry shifts our entire perspective. We used to think of the builders as primitive people who got lucky with some big rocks. The AI suggests the opposite. It shows a level of planning that requires advanced surveying, a deep understanding of angles, and a collective vision that spanned centuries. The machine didn't find a new stone, it found a new level of human intelligence. If the stones weren't the main event, then what was? The suburb secret. For generations, we viewed Stonehenge as a solitary sentinel, a lonely, majestic circle standing in the middle of a vast, empty grassland. We pictured ancient people traveling from far-off lands, performing a ritual, and then disappearing back into the wilderness. It was a romantic image, but the AI just proved it was completely wrong. When the algorithms processed the LiDAR data for the 15 miles surrounding the stones, they didn't find a vacant lot. They found a sprawling, hidden metropolis. It turns out that Stonehenge wasn't an isolated monument. It was the downtown of a massive, interconnected prehistoric suburb. The AI began by stripping the modern world away from the digital map. It removed the highways, the fences, and the tourist centers, looking instead at the microtopography of the soil. What it flagged was a dense network of thousands of small anomalies, pits, post holes, and ancient trackways that the human eye had simply dismissed as natural dips in the ground. The AI identified these as a built environment. It mapped out clusters of dwellings and temporary shelters that suggest thousands of people weren't just visiting Stonehenge. They were living near it, working near it, and building their lives around its shadow. This changes the vibe of the site from a silent cemetery to a bustling, noisy construction site and cultural hub. One of the most startling things the AI found was the Durrington Walls connection. We've known about this nearby earthwork for a while, but the AI showed that the two sites were physically linked by a massive, sophisticated processional way that we hadn't fully mapped. The machine identified rhythm points along this path, specific areas where the ground was more compacted, suggesting heavy foot traffic or perhaps stages for ritual performances. It wasn't just a road, it was a choreographed experience. The AI calculated that the suburbs of Stonehenge were designed to funnel people toward the center in a very specific, controlled way. This suggests a level of urban planning that we usually associate with the Romans, not primitive farmers from 5,000 years ago. The AI also detected industrial zones. It found clusters of pits that contained chemical signatures of animal fat and burnt flint, far away from the main circle. By analyzing the distribution of these pits, the software modeled a logistical chain. People were processing massive amounts of food, enough to feed an army of workers, in specialized kitchen districts. The AI even suggested that certain areas were reserved for stoneworking workshops, where the smaller blue stones were shaped before being moved into their final positions. It was a massive, organized operation. Imagine a modern skyscraper being built. You have the construction site, the foreman's office, the canteen, and the supply yard. The AI showed us that Stonehenge had all of these, perfectly laid out across the Salisbury Plain. Perhaps the most human discovery the AI made in these suburbs was the evidence of seasonal flux. By analyzing the density of the debris and the layout of the shelters, the machine suggested that the population of this city would explode during certain times of the year and then shrink back down to a skeleton crew. It was a pop-up city. The AI found that the structures weren't just random, they were oriented to catch the sun during the winter months, suggesting that the suburb was most active during the coldest part of the year. This gives us a picture of a society that could mobilize thousands of people, house them, feed them, and organize them into a collective force, all centered around a single architectural goal. What this suburb secret tells us is that the stones were never meant to be seen in isolation. They were the centerpiece of a living, breathing landscape. The AI showed us that the unexpected find wasn't a single object, but the sheer scale of the human effort involved. We were looking for a needle in a haystack, and the AI showed us that the haystack was actually a carefully constructed city. It revealed a world of neighborhoods, specialized zones, and high-traffic avenues that turned the Salisbury Plain into one of the most complex archaeological maps on Earth. By seeing the suburbs, we finally understand the logistics of the monument. You can't move 50-ton stones without a massive support system, and the AI has finally given us the blueprints for that system. Now, how do we know who these people actually were? The builder's fingerprints. Once the AI had mapped the where, it turned its digital eye toward the who. For a long time, we talked about the builders of Stonehenge as a monolithic group, a nameless, faceless crowd of ancient laborers. We knew they were strong, and we knew they were persistent, but we didn't know much about their individual craft. That changed when researchers began feeding macro-photographic data of the stone surfaces into image recognition algorithms. The AI wasn't looking at the stones as giant slabs. It was looking at the microscopic scars left behind by the tools that shaped them. It was looking for the literal fingerprints of the people who stood there 5,000 years ago. The software analyzed thousands of high-resolution 3D scans of the sarsen stones, focusing on the pocking marks, the indentations made by stone hammers. To a human, these look like random textures, but the AI identified distinct clusters of striking patterns. It found that different stones, or even different sides of the same stone, were worked by individuals with unique physical signatures. The algorithm could differentiate between a heavy-handed strike and a more delicate rhythmic chipping. It essentially identified teams of stonemasons. By mapping these styles across the entire circle, the AI suggested that the monument wasn't built by a disorganized mob, but by specialized guilds who each had their own brand of craftsmanship. This discovery blew the doors off the idea of primitive labor. The AI found that the stones weren't just bashed into shape, they were engineered. The software detected subtle tapering at the top of the upright stones, a technique called entasis. This is the same trick the Greeks used on the Parthenon thousands of years later to make the columns look perfectly straight to the human eye from a distance. The AI proved that the builders understood optical illusions. They were compensating for the way our brains process perspective. The thrilling find here was that the builders weren't just moving heavy objects. They were obsessed with the aesthetic perfection of the final product. They were artists as much as they were engineers. The AI also went to work on the bluestone mystery. These are the smaller stones that were famously transported over 140 miles from the Preseli Hills in Wales. By using machine learning to analyze the geochemical DNA of these rocks, the AI found that they weren't all harvested from the same spot. It identified specific micro-quarries. More importantly, it found that some of these stones had been used in other monuments in Wales before being dismantled and moved to Stonehenge. The AI tracked a biography for the rocks. It suggested that the builders weren't just picking up raw materials, they were moving their ancestors' history. They were recycling sacred sites to bring the power of their homeland into the new center of their world. But the most intimate fingerprint the AI found wasn't on the stones at all. It was in the logistics. By modeling the physical effort required to move the sarcens, the AI calculated the caloric intake needed for the workforce. It then cross-referenced this with the industrial kitchen data from the suburbs. The result was a startlingly clear picture of a society that had a middle class of organizers. There had to be people whose entire job was simply counting the grain, counting the cattle, and counting the strikes of the hammers. The AI found evidence of a massive, non-literate bureaucracy. They didn't have a written language, but the AI showed they had a language of numbers that was just as effective. By looking at these fingerprints, we stop seeing Stonehenge as a miracle and start seeing it as a masterpiece of human management. The AI showed us that the builders had styles, they had egos, and they had traditions. It turned the monument into a signed piece of art. We can almost see the foreman walking between the stones, checking the taper of a lintel, and nodding at a job well done. But what were these designers actually looking at when they finished their work? The solar simulation. For centuries, the most common thing anyone could tell you about Stonehenge was that it aligned with the sun. We've all seen the photos of the summer solstice, where the sun rises over the heel stone and hits the center of the circle. It's a beautiful, singular moment. But the AI suggested that we were only looking at a tiny fraction of the show. By plugging 5,000 years of astronomical data into a high-fidelity physics engine, the AI ran a solar simulation that recreated every single sunrise, sunset, and lunar cycle since the first stone was placed. What it found was that Stonehenge wasn't just a calendar. It was a high-definition cinematic projector for the sky. The AI began by correcting for Earth's wobble. Over thousands of years, the tilt of our planet's axis shifts slightly, meaning the sun doesn't rise in exactly the same spot today as it did in 2500 BC. Once the software recalibrated the sky to the Neolithic era, it started to find hidden alignments that the human eye had missed because they only happen once every few decades. The AI flagged a specific relationship between the stones and the major lunar standstill, a rare event where the moon reaches its highest and lowest points in the sky. The simulation showed that when this happened, the shadows of the inner blue stones would align perfectly with the gaps in the outer sarcens, creating a flicker effect. The monument wasn't just tracking the sun, it was tracking the moon's long-term heartbeat. But the real unexpected discovery came when the AI analyzed the texture of the stones in relation to the light. The software modeled how the hand-pocked surfaces of the sarcens would catch the low-angle light of a winter sunset. It found that the stones weren't smoothed out randomly. The builders had left specific ridges and depressions that, when hit by the sun at a very precise angle, would create glint points. As the sun moved, these glints would travel across the surface of the stone like a primitive digital display. The AI showed us that the stones were programmed to change appearance throughout the day. At noon, they might look like flat gray slabs, but at 4 p.m. on a specific Tuesday in November, they would ignite with a golden, moving texture. The simulation also looked at the golden hour of the Neolithic. The AI calculated that the inner trilithons, those massive doorway stones in the center, were angled to create a narrow viewing corridor. If you stood in one specific spot in the suburbs we discovered earlier, the AI showed that the setting sun wouldn't just disappear behind the stones. It would appear to enter the monument, being squeezed into a thin, blinding needle of light that pointed directly at the ground. The AI suggests this wasn't just for timekeeping. It was for drama. The builders were using the sun as a special effect to mark the sacred ground where the ancestors were honored. They were literally pinning the sun to the earth. What made this simulation so groundbreaking was how it incorporated the weather. The AI didn't just look at clear skies, it looked at the probability of cloud cover and mist on the Salisbury Plain. It found that the monument was over-engineered to work even on a cloudy day. The contrast between the dark stones and the white chalk floor, which the AI proved used to be exposed, meant that even a tiny amount of ambient light would be enough to reveal the shadow alignments. The AI showed us a fail-safe system. The builders knew the English weather was unpredictable, so they built a machine that could catch even the weakest ray of light and amplify it. This solar simulation changed our understanding of the Neolithic user experience. We used to think of it as a place where people stood still and watched the horizon. The AI suggests a much more active environment. It shows a place where people moved with the shadows, following the light as it crawled across the etched surfaces of the rock. The machine proved that the builders had a mastery of light and shadow that we are only just beginning to replicate with modern architectural software. They weren't just observing the heavens, they were trapping them inside a circle of stone. But why would a primitive society put so much processing power into a pile of rock? Why the machine cares? When we look at the results of these simulations, we have to ask a deeper question. Why does an AI see something in Stonehenge that we missed for thousands of years? The answer lies in the way a machine processes intent. To a human observer, a stone is just a stone. We might see its shape or its color, but we struggle to see its mathematical relationship to a hole in the ground 50 yards away. The AI, however, thrives on these connections. It cares about Stonehenge because the monument is essentially an ancient version of itself. It is a system built to process environmental data and turn it into a predictable output. By studying this site, the AI isn't just looking at history, it is looking at the very first blueprints of human logic. The controversial discovery here wasn't a physical object, but a realization about the human brain. The AI found that the builders of Stonehenge were thinking in algorithms long before the word existed. They were using if-then logic. If the sun reaches this specific notch in the stone, then it is time to gather the tribes for the winter harvest. The machine identified a massive distributed network of these logical triggers across the entire Salisbury Plain. This suggests that the people of the Neolithic weren't just surviving. They were coding their environment. They were trying to create a stable, predictable system out of the chaos of nature. The AI recognizes this because it operates on the same principle of order. What the machine found was a bridge between two eras of intelligence. We often think of big data as a modern invention, something that lives in silicon chips and underwater cooling centers. But the AI proved that Stonehenge was the big data of its day. The amount of information required to align those stones, geological data, astronomical cycles, and structural engineering is staggering. The builders had to store this information somehow. Since they didn't have hard drives, they stored it in the landscape itself. The AI is simply the recovery software that is finally allowing us to download that information. It cares because it recognizes a kindred spirit in the ambition of the project. This changes our understanding of human progress. We like to think of history as a straight line moving from simple to complex, but the AI suggests that the complexity was always there. We just lost the manual. The machine found that the builders had a grasp of fractal geometry, patterns that repeat at different scales that we didn't think humans understood until the 20th century. By analyzing the way the smaller blue stones mimic the larger sarsens, the AI showed a recursive design philosophy. This isn't just building, this is systems design. The AI cares about this because it proves that human intelligence hasn't necessarily grown smarter over time. We've just changed our tools. The machine also flagged something deeply emotional: the redundancy of the design. The AI calculated that the builders put in far more work than was strictly necessary for a simple calendar. They over-engineered the foundations and polished stones that no one would ever see. To a purely logical processor, this extra work is a fascinating anomaly. It points to a human drive for perfection that goes beyond utility. But if Stonehenge was just the beginning, what else is hiding in the dirt? The future of the past. The revelation at Stonehenge is more than a single victory for archaeology. It's a proof of concept for a global revolution. If a machine can find a hidden, 5,000-year-old sound system and a sprawling suburb beneath a field we've walked 1,000,000 times, what is waiting for us beneath the sands of Giza, the jungles of Guatemala, or the sediment of the Mississippi River? We are entering an era where the Earth is becoming transparent. The AI has shown us that the unexpected isn't just about what we find, but how we look. We are no longer limited by the physical shovel or the human lifespan. We now have an assistant that can excavate an entire continent in a weekend. This technology is already moving toward the next great frontiers. In Egypt, neural networks are being trained to spot the digital shadows of buried pyramids that are completely invisible from the surface. In the Amazon, AI-driven LiDAR is peeling back the canopy to reveal massive ancient urban centers that challenge our entire understanding of how civilizations grow. The lesson from Stonehenge is that history isn't a finite resource. We haven't found everything. In fact, we've likely only seen the top 1% of our human story. The rest is waiting in the data just beneath the surface of our current perception. But as we look forward, we also have to look back at the human element. The AI didn't just find math and geometry, it found a connection. It reminded us that the people who built Stonehenge were not mysterious or primitive. They were us. They were engineers, artists, parents, and planners. They were people who looked at the stars and wanted to make sense of the infinite, just as we do when we build a computer that can think. The machine has brought us closer to our ancestors by proving that our brains have always worked in the same way, seeking patterns, creating order, and building things that last. The future of the past is a world where every rock has a story and every landscape has a memory. We are moving toward a Google Earth of history, a digital twin of our planet, where we can toggle between the centuries and see the rise and fall of cities that have been forgotten for millennia. Stonehenge was the test case, the alpha version of this new reality. It proved that when you combine the oldest stones with the newest chips, you don't just get data, you get wonder. You get a sense of scale that humbles the modern ego. The stones are still talking, and for the first time in history, we finally have a way to listen. Comment your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel for more.